Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ekrem Ok. I am a lecturer at Ibrahim Cecen University, Turkey, and staff director of the CESRAN International. It's a great pleasure to be here today and have an opportunity to share my work with such an esteemed audience. And I would like to thank the conveners of this conference for providing such a platform for us. And thank you for this occasion. My title of presentation is Revisiting Criteria for Humanitarian Intervention in Academic Research. Humanitarian intervention is one of the leading controversies in international relations. To clarify it with some metaphors, should we intervene if our neighbor's husband beat up his wife, or should we intervene if a criminal attempts to harm a neighbor's children and their father is unable to protect them? The concept of humanitarian intervention emerged as a possible solution to this dilemma. It implies the military intervention of a country, a group of countries, or international organization to internal affairs of another country. Following the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the international system witnessed some radical change. The concept of international security has become more diverse. Not only military matters, but also social, economic, environmental, and humanitarian matters have become subject of security. Moreover, the structure of international system has evolved from the interstate dispute to intrastate conflict. Both for the humanitarian reason and the potential risk to international peace and security, these intrastate conflicts were called for intervention to resolve. During this period, humanitarian intervention gained increased attention. Academics, states, and international organizations began to breach the wall of the non-interference and attach less importance to the concept of national sovereignty. However, one of the biggest challenges for the scholars working on humanitarian intervention is the lack of the consensus on its definition and criteria. Politicians, soldiers, and scholars have used the term of humanitarian interventions with very different meanings. An intervention may be considered humanitarian in one study, while the same intervention may not be regarded as humanitarian in another study. However, this plurality of definition can be argued to be both a challenge and strange. While it may prevent the formation of rigid, universally accepted definition, it also allows the social science to be open and new interpretations. On the other hand, when we work in the field of humanitarian intervention, we cannot choose our case randomly. We need some criteria to determine whether an intervention is humanitarian or not. The scholars working on humanitarian intervention generally follow two paths. While the majority prefer to use criteria derived from the just war theory, others propose their own set of criteria. The common opinion is to use criteria derived from the just war theory, which are the right authority, which means interveners must be a legitimate authority, just cause, interveners must have a just cause to intervene, right intention, intervention must be accompanied by right intention. In other words, aim of the intervention must be just. Last resort, intervene only when all alternative means has been exhausted. In other words, intervention must be last viable option. The proportionality means intervention must do more good than harm. High probability of success, there must be a belief that chaos can be achieved with this intervention. The open declaration, an open public declaration is required before the intervention. I said optional in this because some studies do not include this criterion. However, these criteria present two challenges in academic research. The first challenge is difficulty of finding cases that fulfill all criteria. It is particularly challenging to identify such case during and before the Cold War. And indeed, no example of intervention since 1945 meet all these criteria. The second challenge is that this criteria functions more like as guidelines for state on how and when to intervene, rather than as criteria for identifying a case whether it's humanitarian or not. Just war criteria provide guidelines for states to follow before intervening for humanitarian purpose. However, these criteria are not useful for determining whether an intervention in the past is humanitarian or not. After analyzing cases, definitions, and all existing criteria for humanitarian intervention, this study aims to introduce 5 criteria developed to assist scholars working on humanitarian intervention for case selection. Before introducing, it will be useful to underline that this study doesn't claim that the intervention that meet all these criteria are true examples of humanitarian intervention. Indeed, no intervention in the history can be called a true humanitarian intervention. This criteria aims only to help us to find case to analyze. The first criterion is humanitarian emergency. There must be a humanitarian emergency in the target country. This criterion differs humanitarian intervention from other military interventions. The second criterion is unwillingness or unableness of the target state. The target states must be unwilling or unable to stop the humanitarian crisis within its territory, or it must be one of the creators of this crisis. Otherwise, it will be intervening in a country which is already dealing with stopping the humanitarian crisis. The third criterion is that intervention should be conducted by military means. This criterion distinguishes humanitarian intervention from non-military initiatives such as humanitarian aid and humanitarian relief. The fourth criterion is the intervention must have a humanitarian dimension. This criterion separates humanitarian intervention from other military operations. I need to elaborate the humanitarian dimension part. The reason for using the term of humanitarian dimension rather than public declaration is to ensure that this criterion can also apply to cases before the 1990, where humanitarian purpose of the intervention was not publicly declared. If we accept public declaration as a criterion, we cannot find any intervention before 1990. Because there were some examples of intervention before the 1990 that were not aimed at resolving humanitarian crisis, but yielded humanitarian results, such as Indian intervention in East Pakistan and Tanzanian intervention in Uganda. For this reason, the humanitarian dimension in the intervention is required. If there is no public declaration of humanitarian reason before the intervention, the humanitarian outcome is required to accept as a case. The last criterion is consent. Many scholars have argued that humanitarian intervention should be conducted without the consent of the target states. However, this study doesn't necessarily require non-consensual intervention to classify as humanitarian. Instead, it prefers to use with or without consent. In other words, the intervention with consent or invitation can be a humanitarian intervention. Lack of consent is not required for an intervention to be considered as humanitarian. The 1992 Somali, 1994 Rwanda, and 2000 Sierra Leone interventions are good examples of this intervention with consent. However, in such case, an additional sub-question is required to accept as a case. In such case, perpetrator of the crisis must be a non-state actor. The sub-question is about the state's unableness to stop the humanitarian crisis. If a country is unable to stop humanitarian crisis within its territory, its border, it may consent to other countries to step in to do so, and this consent doesn't prevent the intervention from becoming humanitarian. Considering all of these criteria, this study also offered the following definition of humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention is the military intervention by a third country, a group of countries, or an international organization to internal affairs of a country with a group of people suffer from human rights violations, either with or without the target state consent. And this is our criteria and an example of East Timor, and the flow chart of the last criteria. And thank you for attention. I am open any question, comment, or contribution you would like to make in the end of the session. Thank you for listening.